Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm well.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You're Lisa Goldman, and you had it's called the Israel-Palestine Initiative at the New America Foundation. Is that right?
Yep. We now call it New America, but yes.
Don't get me
I know.
started.
What
I
can I
actually
say?
have an
I just have,
affiliation. I actually have an affiliation myself. I am a future tense fellow or something, and I don't know about this rebranding thing, but whatever. It's done,
take it
and we
up with
love
the
it.
VIPs.
What's that?
Take it up with the big
Yeah, it's
honchos.
above our pay grade, and we love it. We love it, I think.
We do.
But anyway, you're right. It's technically called New America.
Hmm.
And I guess names like that can work. Worked for J Street, right? It's not like the
Uh,
J Street Foundation.
was it ever?
No, but I mean, I just mean that's a like
Oh, I
when J
see.
Street started. I thought, well, shouldn't it be called something, like the American Israel Friendship Committee or something? What's
Yeah.
this J Street business? But I guess it works, and so I
Uh,
guess New America can
it
work.
caught on. I hope it catches on.
Okay. Well, you've just betrayed something about your ideology in saying that. But that is what we're going to talk about: Israel, Palestine, and more specifically Gaza.
Mhm.
It's been pretty depressing news lately. I don't know if there's any point in reviewing. I mean, the last report was that the only real power station in Gaza got blown up. I don't know that Israel has yet said that it did it, but somebody did. Uh, what is your do you see any rays of hope here at all?
No, no, I don't actually. And I know that, that's the thing that people look for, right? Is some hope. I think though that in the short to medium term, at least, there's really no hope. I just don't, the president, it seems based on a report that I just read that President Obama called Netanyahu just a couple of days ago or yesterday and really demanded in very forceful language that he agree to a unilateral ceasefire and stop the aggression against Gaza. I believe the word he used was aggression. And Netanyahu just flat out refused. The question is though, like, what's the end game here? And I'm, there's quite a wide range of opinions. I was just speaking to a Palestinian colleague who works for a pretty prominent publication, and she thinks that right for now, she thinks that the Israeli government seems to just want to exhaust people in Gaza. And she could be right. She certainly has been in the past. She's been sort of level-headed and detached. She's never been a person who's given to jingoism or excessive emotionalism. She just said she thinks people that the idea is just to wear people out.
Well, they're doing a good job of it. And I guess it's hard as a political matter for Netanyahu to stop the offensive so long as there are missiles coming over from Gaza. Is that your sense?
Well, yes, but you have to understand that yes, it's true that the rockets are certainly. It's very hard to argue with Israelis or with anyone for that matter who says no government in the world would tolerate rockets being launched at its civilian population centers, and that's quite true. But also, I don't think that there are many people in the world who would tolerate being under a military blockade for 8 years, which is what's the case for Gaza. Gaza has been under Israeli blockade since 2007, 2006, 2007. That means no import, export, very limited movement through the borders. It means there's a naval blockade. It means that fishermen can't go more than 4 nautical miles from the shore. It means that the entire economy is pretty much fully dependent on tunnel smuggling and NGO handouts and sinecures for former Fatah employees who are paid from Ramallah, from the PA office in Ramallah. I think they have 85% of the population of 1.8 million people in Gaza depends to some extent on NGO aid, either in food or money, mostly food, and 45% unemployment, a pretty highly educated population, relatively speaking, high literacy. Um, a lot of people graduate from university. It's a minor tech hub for developing tech applications in Arabic, but they really can't develop their economy. They're just, they've got drones overhead. They've got these tanks, Israeli tanks, perched on hills looking over Gaza from land, naval ships in the sea, and the occasional bombardment. And let's be clear, these you know organized military assaults that come that's based on recent history, have been coming every couple of years, are punctuated by regular bombardments, so just flyovers and targeted assassinations and so forth. So it's not like everything's quiet and then all of a sudden there's this massive military assault. These things are going on all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are some limited exports and or imports permitted, but I also think that, at least it's Gaza's perception, that the agreement at the end of the last war, the agreement under the ceasefire that ended the last war, was not fully carried out. In terms of, there were allusions in that agreement to an easing of the economic blockade, which I think by and large did not happen. And of course, this got worse because now that there's an unfriendly government in Egypt, unfriendly to Hamas, since the coup in Egypt, they shut down the tunnels that went into Egypt, and those were the commercial tunnels. Those were the way they got around the blockade.
Sure. I mean, both Israel and Egypt knew that the number of trucks carrying aid and food that Israel permits to go overland into Gaza daily is not sufficient for the entire population. They have to smuggle things underground. So you have this sort of bizarre situation whereby Egypt and Israel are both condemning the tunnels that lead from Gaza to the Sinai, and at the same time they know that if those tunnels are completely blocked off, there's going to be a humanitarian crisis.
Right.
Those tunnels are used to import fuel, every single consumer good you can imagine, cement for building things. I mean, there's just no way that the trucks that cross through Karmi crossing that divides Israel and Gaza can supply all the needs for the people of Gaza. So the problem for Egypt, I mean, yes, Sisi has, he hates the Muslim Brotherhood. He has a rabid hatred for them. He's killed hundreds of them, put thousands in jail. And Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So no love lost there. But Morsi wasn't particularly kind to Hamas either. Yes, there was some limit. He did lift some of the more onerous restrictions on freedom of movement at the Rafah crossing, but he wasn't showering them with gold and opening the border up. But Sisi has another problem. He's got militants in northern Sinai, right? And so those tunnels are pretty convenient for militants who want to slip in and out. And I think that's one of the reasons that he's been flooding them and closing them down.
Yeah, I mean, as for financial support for Hamas, that's their other problem, is that once they distance themselves from the Syrian regime, when it looked like the Syrian regime was doomed, that I gather greatly reduced the support they got from Syria and from Iran. In fact, I've heard that this time around, almost very few of the rockets are made in Iran.
Right.
More of them are homemade, and maybe that, and they're actually not performing as well as they were last time around. So now their main financial supporter, I guess, is Qatar.
Qatar, yeah.
And that's one of the few. And I guess Israel does not want Qatar to be part of these negotiations, but Qatar is almost, aside from Turkey, the only country that can communicate with Hamas in a way that Hamas trusts, and it's also one of the country that probably has the most leverage because it has provided support. So if they're not part of this, I'm not. I just don't know what. I have trouble imagining how this is going to play out at this point, because it's hard for either side to back down, to be seen as backing down.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm sorry. Qatar is, still involved. Definitely, they support the Muslim Brotherhood, and that makes them a very uneasy partner for Egypt in trying to trying to draw up a ceasefire. But I understood from a couple of tweets that were published today by Gal Berger, who's the Israel Broadcast Authority correspondent for Arab Affairs. He speaks fluent Arabic. He's a colleague of mine. He's a very careful reporter, and he said that as far as he understands, Iran is still trying to rearm Hamas now. So they're not completely out of the picture.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What? I mean, one thing I've always wondered is, well, let me say something actually in defense of Israel, kind of. I don't think their response, I mean, given the threat that they actually face and the sense of threat, even if those missiles are very unlikely to hit anything, it's still not a good feeling when they're coming in. I think given that, their geopolitical situation, the history, everything, I don't think they're reacting any more irrationally than the U.S. reacted to 9/11. On the other hand, I considered that reaction very irrational, and I think it's been shown to be disastrous in the long run. And what I wonder is whether Israel thinks about the possible long-term blowback of having more people in the world hate it, and more people in the world being anti-Semitic, probably, as a result of this. Even though that's kind of an illogical inference, to generalize about Jews because of the behavior of Israel, but still, I suspect that's an effect of this. And and I've already seen reports that this war is helping jihadist recruiters. I mean, do you? I'm sure you pay more attention to what is said in Israel and the op-eds there and so on than I do. Does that seem to enter the political calculus at all? That maybe this is short run effective in some sense, but long run counterproductive?
Sure. First of all people behave irrationally when they feel threatened.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a template for human behavior. We saw what happened in the States after 9/11. What's interesting, though, for the States is that 10 years later, people are looking back at the way they reacted and a decade ago and saying, what came over me? It takes a certain length of time for the human mind or the human psyche to recover from that kind of trauma. In Israel, you have this constant sense of being under threat. So people are always feeling reacting sort of irrationally because they always feel under threat. And this is a scaremongering far right wing government that has been sort of encouraging people to feel that the whole world is against them. And that's very much a part of the popular Israeli narrative, that people don't understand what it's like to be under rocket fire, that Hamas and Hamas specifically and the Palestinians in general and the Middle East as well, and the wider Middle East as well, they're all out to undermine, to threaten our right to exist. This is an existential fear, and people turn to Europe and they say, look at these anti-Semitic demonstrations that have erupted now in Paris, for example. Mm-hmm. So there is this sense of the whole. There is a sense of being victimized, and the whole world against us, rational or not. And I don't present this analysis as justification, but if people want to understand why Israeli actors and the Israeli public behave as they do, then they need to understand that mentality and where it comes from. Mm-hmm. So yes, there is a sense of victimization. The current government, which is, the Netanyahu-led government, has been in power now for quite a bit, 5-6 years. They've, the latest governing coalition is composed of some very far right-wing racist partners. And they have been ratcheting up the fear factor and the victimization factor. And you would be amazed in a small country how quickly and effectively that sort of mentality filters down, even into the minds of people who say that they don't agree with the government or they hadn't voted for that government. But that's sort of, when you say those things over and over and over again, they do have an effect. Now, is there opposition in Israel? Are there people who are saying they disagree with this victimization mentality, that they don't feel that the whole world's out to get them? For sure, there are. But during times of war, and I lived in Israel through 3 wars, and through the entire suicide bombing era from 2000 and from 2000 to 2002, and I remember very well how it feels. It's you feel very discombobulated. You're always slightly off balance. Your emotions are quite vulnerable. You can kind of erupt now and then at the slightest little push, and it's very, very difficult, especially in the current environment, which has shifted so far to the right, to express opposition. Mm-hmm. This is the first time that every single demonstration against a war has been physically attacked by far right-wing nationalists. This never happened before. Mm-hmm. The police in some cases have done a pretty good job in separating the two camps, but in other cases they've abandoned ship and there have been some physical clashes. This is unprecedented and it's very worrying.
Mm-hmm. One complaint about, when people say, if you criticize Israel's behavior in this case and say you think they've gone overboard, a common thing is, well, what would you do if missiles were raining down on your country? And then a common reply to that is, well, first of all, Israel should have been taking two-state negotiations much more seriously all along. Or maybe they should have been actually even reaching out to Hamas or whatever. But the point is, in the diplomatic front, they should have been doing a lot more. And one thing I wonder is that possible given the current composition of Israel? I think you can always say, well, it's just this conservative government, but the conservative government was, it reflects the results of the last election as manifest in ultimately in coalitions, that formed. And maybe Netanyahu could, in principle, choose a different coalition and move to the left and get a two-state solution done. But I'm not honestly sure. I just don't know whether the weight of opinion in Israel broadly will at this point permit them to do the things they would need to do to get a two-state solution. What do you think about that?
So there are two questions here. One is the public is the public interested in a two-state solution, and the other is Netanyahu interested in a two-state solution. I think the public is, in principle, yes, according to the polls that are taken every so often, yes, they are interested in principle in a two-state solution. But then when you itemize the compromises that they will have to make, they're less interested in a two-state solution. And that's because really the government, successive governments, and I'm not going to blame only the Netanyahu government, successive governments over the past couple of decades have simply not prepared the people for what compromise means and how to protect themselves and reassured them. People are very afraid. I think that's something that you find in Israel a lot, is that people are very afraid. They feel very threatened. Is Netanyahu interested in a two-state solution? And the answer is most emphatically no. He said that on the record quite recently at the Herzliya conference that he would never accept a two-state solution. More specifically, he said he would never accept a demilitarized West Bank. Okay. I mean, he would never accept the idea of having a Palestinian state in the West Bank that had no Israeli military presence in it. And that's impossible. You cannot have an independent Palestinian state that has an Israeli military presence. That's just another name for the occupation. So Netanyahu has said definitively that he will never accept a two-state solution. The popular mood is, sure, we'd like two states in principle, but Jordan Valley withdraw from settlements that we really consider now to be neighborhoods of Jerusalem, places like Ma'ale Adumim, Ramot, Gilo. These neighborhoods, they're not. These settlements are really considered part of Jerusalem. They're connected by the light railway. They're not populated by extremists who are running around burning Palestinian farmers' olive trees. Most of them are normal middle-class people looking for slightly less expensive housing that's on the public transportation within the greater Jerusalem area. So when people say, we have to give those chunks of territory back to the Palestinians, people say, no, hang on, that's too much. I'm in favor of peace and I want a two-state solution, but we can't compromise that much. So I think that people just don't understand or are not willing to understand and accept that two states means a lot of compromise. And that's because they feel threatened.
Right. Yeah. When I was there in 2011 and visited both Israel and the West Bank, I mean, that my perception was that, the settlements have become so pervasive and the whole infrastructure that supports them have become so pervasive and so many people living in them that when you imagine the amount of political will it would take to withdraw enough of the settlements to give the Palestinians a sense that they actually have a state and some dignity, I just was not sure it could happen. And I think you're right that the sense of threat is the problem. I mean, Daniel Levy, whom I'm sure you know,
sure.
Actually during that visit said, he thought the problem is when there's something like the Second Intifada, they're so threatened that they don't trust the Palestinians, they can't do a deal then. And then when there's no sense of threat, they kind of, they just kind of forget about it. I mean, there's no sense of urgency to do a deal. Right.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, I think Thomas Friedman even quoted a line similar to that in his book From Beirut to Jerusalem. When he writes, "When my enemy is strong, how can I compromise? And when my enemy is weak, why should I compromise?" Mm-hmm. And I think that's absolutely true in the Middle East. It's been the pattern for ages between the Israelis and the Palestinians. There just seems to be a profound unwillingness to compromise. Again, I understand the source of that unwillingness, but it makes me it's upsetting, and I also have to interject here that the Israeli media is doing a pretty poor job of covering of humanizing the Palestinians. I would say, okay, more accurately, is that they do a pretty effective job dehumanizing them. And every time you see an article about Palestinians, it's teenagers with their faces wrapped in keffiyehs, burning rubber tires, throwing stones. If you call, and I've called Israeli colleagues and asked them questions about basic aspects of Israel's control over Palestinian resources and infrastructure, and no one knows, no one's aware of day-to-day life in Gaza or the West Bank unless it involves violence against Israeli Jews. They're just unaware. They don't know, for example, that Israel quarries rocks from Palestinian West Bank quarries and that they sell it as Israeli stone. They don't know that. They don't know that Israel completely controls the magnetic fields and that they don't allow the Palestinian telecoms to have access to mobile broadband. When I discussed this recently with a colleague who works for a leading Israeli newspaper, he just sighed and said, it sounds awful. But if the story doesn't involve violence perpetrated by Palestinians against Jews, then we just don't cover it. People don't know. So the people on the other side of the wall, especially in Gaza, they never come into Israel. They're just not quite human anymore. And that really, it's very difficult to think about compromising with people who are only portrayed in the news as a threat.
Yeah. Now, today there was an interesting, I don't know if you saw this piece that John Chait wrote for New York Magazine today, Jonathan Chait.
No, I missed it. Tell me.
Well, it's interesting because, he's, in my traditional assessment, fairly ardently pro-Israel. Doesn't write about it a lot.
Oh, is that the one where he says why he's less pro-Israel?
Why he's less pro-Israel?
Yeah, I glanced at it.
Than he used to be. And Roger Cohen, who has never been some kind of right winger, but wrote a column, I think today.
He did.
That was just kind of starting to move himself away from Zionism as it exists in Israel right now, but not from Zionism generically. And I'm wondering if you see a shift in opinion, and maybe, as you compare the way like America has processed this series of wars, comparing this to the last one or the one before that, if you're sensing any shift in the narrative here that maybe Israel should be paying attention to.
I do. I don't think Israelis will pay attention to it, but I think they should. There is a shift in the discourse. You can see that in the column, Roger Cohen's column of today. You can see that in Jonathan Friedland's piece for the New York Review of Books that came out this week. You can see that in Gabor Mate's. He's a Canadian academic. He wrote a very personal, sort of emotional op-ed for the Toronto Star. He was a Hungarian child survivor of the Holocaust. These people who grew up as liberal Zionists, and a liberal Zionist means Palestinians and Israelis living side by side, each in their own state, with trade and commerce and tolerance and so forth. I think for the vast majority of Jews in the post-Holocaust era, especially, Israel has become a very fundamental totem of their identity. I was certainly raised that way in my Jewish community and at my Jewish school and at my synagogue. Israel was, almost a mythical place, that was filled with state builders and socialists and people who wanted to build a better future for the Jewish people, and not just as a sort of insurance policy in case the Nazis came to the Upper West Side. I'm being glib, but you know what I mean. But really as a place that was better than the rest of the world. And now, even though these people are intelligent, thinking, critical, highly educated adults, there is a certain emotional attachment to Israel that really is quite primordial and almost childlike, and that's not meant as an insult. We all absorb certain myths and ideas from our early childhood, and we cherish them. And I think that what people like Roger Cohen and Jonathan Friedland and Gabor Mate and perhaps even Peter Beinart are grappling with right now, and I went through that myself. I don't mean to patronize. Is like, what do you do when this place that you were raised to idealize is suddenly turning out not to be just deeply flawed, but perhaps fatally flawed? What do you do with that understanding and that knowledge? It's quite difficult. especially because you don't want to turn your back on it. There are people there that you love. There are things about it that you love. There are many things about the Israeli national character that are very charming and lovable. And this is a place of human beings, and they're complex human beings. What are you just going to say? Oh, sorry, it's not quite what I planned, this Zionist experiment. I must turn my back now and focus on my own country and just, be sad for a bit and move on. It can't be. There are 7 million human beings living there. So we have to figure out, I think, a way to go forward. What I'm seeing right now, and again, I don't mean to be disparaging, but what I'm seeing right now amongst liberal Zionists is they're looking at the situation and they're saying, maybe it's never going to get better. Maybe this situation is never. Maybe there really is never going to be a two-state solution. So there's a certain amount of breastfeeding at this stage and anguish. But what I'm trying to do at New America, I'm sorry, here's my plug, is to get beyond the breastfeeding and the tension between this one state, two state binary, and just look at the situation more, how should I say, holistically, and look at, okay, these are two peoples that are not going anywhere. They deserve a better future. Let's look at other alternatives that are neither the one state or the two state scenarios, but something that's justice, and that provides justice and enfranchisement and a better future for everyone.
That would be nice. It's interesting. I think there was a piece in, I think, National Journal saying Bibi should pay attention to what you and I have been talking about, the way the discourse is changing in America, and laying out several, this was a few days ago, several pieces of evidence, and culminating with this David Grossman piece in the New York Times that said, why haven't you been reaching out to Hamas and so on? And I noticed that David Frum was tweeting this piece as if he wanted Bibi to pay attention, and to see David Frum tweeting a piece implicitly, kind of culminating with the idea that Bibi should have been reaching out to Hamas, suggests to me that there is real concern in the American pro-Israel committee that Israel is not getting the picture about the way world opinion is changing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Look, Netanyahu he spent most of his young adult life in the States. He was Benjamin Netai. He lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He had a non-Jewish wife. He was very American. He speaks completely flawless English. Mm-hmm. And he's surrounded by people who are super savvy about the American media, or they're supposed to be. Ron Dermer, for example, who's the Israeli ambassador to the States, right, to Washington right now, was born and raised in the States. Michael Oren, same thing. He was Ron Dermer's predecessor. So these guys sort of make Netanyahu feel like they have their finger on the pulse of the American media scene and the American Jewish community, but they don't. What they do have is very powerful relationship with the leaders, the super rich, unelected leaders of the Jewish federations, who are mostly Republican oriented, but they're a minority. They don't represent the Jewish community opinion. They don't represent their constituents, for lack of a better word. Most Jews, I think 74, 73%, they voted for Obama. They voted for the Democratic Party. They are Democrats. Mm-hmm. They're liberals. So I think Netanyahu and his team at the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem have profoundly misread the American media climate, which is basically liberal. There was something else about your question I wanted to answer. What was the other part of your question?
Well, it had to do with American, like David Frum, of the world growing concerned.
Sure. I mean, look, you can't. That's actually a really important point that I'm so glad you raised. One of the things that the David Frums and the Netanyahus have ignored is that every single director of Shin Bet, Israel's General Security Service, and the Israeli equivalent of the FBI, and a former director of the Mossad, Ephraim Halevi, have written and said, very explicitly and vigorously and vehemently on the record that Israel must talk to Hamas. No ifs, ands, or buts about this. You have to talk to Hamas. You can't just say, well, it's a terrorist organization, I'm not going to talk to them. You have to talk to them. You don't talk to your friends. You talk, when you're talking peace, you talk to your enemies. And I'm not saying that Hamas is the most popular movement in amongst the Palestinians right now. As far as I understand, it's not. But they have a very strong grip on power in Gaza right now, which is largely the fault of Israel's policies. Got to talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that David Frum is really recognizing that this extreme recalcitrance on the part of the Netanyahu government has, been a big mistake. And what you have now is a national mood, what people have been hearing for years now. Hamas is a terrorist organization. They're on the list of they're on the State Department's list of terrorist organizations. We don't talk to terrorists. Well, guess what? Everyone talks to terrorists. And right now, the United States is involved in direct negotiations with Iran, and Iran funds Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is on the list of terrorist organizations from the State Department as well. You have to talk to these people. You can't just say, no, we won't talk, because then in the end, if you don't talk, then you have this untenable situation that we have right now.
Yeah. And it does seem to me that what's happening right now is just kind of almost reversing the preferred Israeli narrative. The Israeli narrative has been, look at us. We've got all of these crazy radicals who are going to hate us no matter what we do, and we are this bastion of civilization. What can you do? But it's like almost as the onslaught continues in Gaza, I think more and more people are going like, Israel is behaving like
yes.
crazily. It's like yes. They're going to get a reputation as like a crazy state, and they want it to be the narrative again has been crazy radicals. Maybe sometimes the subtext was crazy Arabs, crazy Muslims, but whatever, it worked in the court of public opinion to a large extent. And I just think, I don't know, I get a sense that things are being processed a little differently this time.
Sure, and also amongst my liberal Arab friends, all academics, people living in the Arab world, who are not, they're not virulently anti-Israel. These are, detached observers, policy analysts, and who have always had a sort of a sneaking, not exactly an admiration for Israel, but they've sort of maybe a quiet appreciation, shall we say, for the institutions that Israel has as a democratic state. Mm-hmm. A lot of them are now writing to me and saying, looking at what's going on in Gaza and saying, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. That's not what I want to hear from my friends who are so disheartened they can hardly get out of bed from depression over what happened to their revolution in Egypt or in Syria. I don't want to hear welcome to the neighborhood from those friends, but that's what I'm hearing.
Right. Yeah, and I want to emphasize again, as you said, I'm not saying Israel's behaving any more crazily than the average human being would behave under those circumstances.
No, absolutely not.
And certainly no more than, again, America did after 9/11. You can understand all this stuff in terms of human beings acting the way human beings do, and that's maybe the depressing thing.
Absolutely. But again, as you're saying, and this is a super important point to make, America behaved irrationally after 9/11 out of pure fear, and that's understandable. And I think now people are looking back ruefully at that response and saying, I wish we'd done things differently. But the thing is, you need a few years to calm down after a sort of an explosion of fear like that. And Israel has gone to war 4 times in the last 8 years, and then they had 2 years. We had a few months of a suicide bombing every single day.
Now, there's always something in their immediate environment to get scared of.
Yeah, that's right.
If you let very much time pass at all, and that's something that isn't the case with the United States, at least so far. Knock on wood.
And look at what Jody Redoran's piece today in the New York Times, when she describes the really fearful Israeli response to this to the discovery of this network of tunnels that Hamas had built into Israel. Now, we know, everybody in the policy world knows that the Israeli government has been aware of that network of tunnels for several years now. That's how Gilad Shalit was abducted in 2006 from inside Israeli territory. But they're presenting this discovery as if it's something that they just happened to come across while they were trying to stop the rockets through this military this military operation against Gaza. And people are now imagining, swarms of zombie Hamas terrorists, coming up through holes in the ground and shooting everything in sight and taking captives. This is, these are very fearful images.
Yeah. It's kind of like Americans imagining every mosque in America, and some Americans do imagine this. Every mosque in America is a haven for radicals. Once you start thinking that way, it can be a slippery slope.
Very slippery slope.
Okay, well, listen, thanks so much for taking the time, Lisa.
Thank you.
Good to get to know you a little. And good
Very
luck
mutual.
with your work at New America.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it.
Okay,
Take care.
you too.
Bye.